Welcome back, and today we are going to be taking a look at IRCCM missiles and how to defeat them reliably. Because no, they are not some black magic, they are definitely a mechanic that needs a little bit of work to get completely used to. But if this is you, where you are dropping flares, you think it's RNG, you're just kind of trying some things and you think, well, the first missile misses, that means my RNG is now all up, so the second one will definitely hit. You still try to panic and flare a little bit, it hits. And most of the time, this is not a matter of RNG, but flaring improperly. So let's take a look at some guidelines, some tips, and just some general pointers to make sure that this doesn't happen nearly as often as it does right now. Flares are of course just hot balls that are floating in the air, but there are some things that you want to keep track of. The first being directional launchers. Some flares shoot straight up, some go straight behind, and some get dumped downwards, and it's very important to keep track of this so that you can aim the flares properly, because yes, you can't just spam the button and hope for the best. And then the second mechanic is luminosity and rise time, and let me explain it to you with this little graph right here. A little while ago they added rise time to flares, and rise time is essentially the time it takes for the flare to start cooking and reach its optimal luminosity. And the luminosity, very simply said, is just the brightness of the flare or the temperature or how distracting it's going to be when it comes into the FOV of a heat seeker. And what is the FOV, you might ask? Well, that ties in perfectly into the seeker mechanics. We have FOV and bandwidth. We also have IRCCM, of course, but I'll get to that in a minute here. First, I want to explain to you what the FOV does and why it's so important. The FOV dictates how much the missile can actually see at whatever location it's pointed at. Here we have a 3.5 degree FOV missile, the R73. And because it's so wide, if this F-16 were to either pop flares up, to the back, or straight below, you can tell that it's basically always going to be in the FOV, and the missile is going to be fooled relatively easily, as long as you have enough luminosity, which again ties in with the bandwidth. Every heat signature has a different kind of wavelength, and every wavelength has to be picked up with a different bandwidth. And these bandwidths have different sensitivities, and I will try to visualize this to you with this F-15 right here. Let's remove the background to make it a little bit easier to see, and let's take a look at relative bandwidth. First we have the afterburner, then we have the regular engine, we have the actual airframe itself, and that's how all aspect missiles pick up their target, and lastly we have flares. Now to make it a little bit more practical, I'm gonna use a Seekerhead of different missiles to visualize to you what the differences in bandwidth do. Let's get started with something common like the AIM-9G. Medium sensitivity to flares, high FOV. Here's the Seekerhead, that is what it's going to be seeing. It's relatively wide, but that's the point. It doesn't see the actual frame because it's not an all-aspect missile, so it only sees the afterburner and the normal engine. The normal engine is of course not as hot, so all it really sees is the afterburner. But now you pop a flare and you can tell that this is what's supposed to happen, right? Yes, however, it is still dependent on the amount of coverage that you have with the heat, and despite the flare being hotter than the engine, because the engine is much bigger, especially if you have two afterburners, it still overpowers the flare that it has. Now if you drop multiple flares, there's more flares, more luminosity, and then the seeker will prefer the flares again. So be careful to actually cut your afterburner with these missiles, because keeping your afterburner on will sometimes even get you killed versus the weakest of missiles. As these missiles get more advanced, they also become less sensitive to flares. The AIM-9L, for example, that we have right here is just as sensitive to the flares as it is to the engine. So here luminosity becomes very important. You want to overpower the heat of the engine. Now, you can do this by dropping more flares or running flare reinforced. Flares reinforced make it a lot easier to get the adequate amount of luminosity into the Seekerhead at the same time. It becomes borderline mandatory with IRCCM missiles, but we'll get to that in a minute here. From behind AIM-9Ls, make sure to drop your afterburner because you are eating shit about 95% of the time if you don't. Now when the FOV becomes a lot smaller, you can tell that once the flare drops, it's still in the FOV, but it still has the rise time going on, so it's actually not hot enough, and by the time it's warmed up, it is nowhere near the FOV anymore, and the flares will be completely ignored. And this is how the Gatewith, in a very simple manner of explaining it, actually functions. And then we have the AIM-9M, which functions quite differently. The FOV is much wider, which it needs to rear quite a lot after losing it, and it doesn't really have a difference in sensitivity between the engine and the flares. The second it starts seeing flares, it does something very simple. it simply shuts off, and it kind of just keeps itself shut off until it sees no flares again, and then it reacquires the lock with its white FOV. The missile is of course not stupid. If you keep flying straight, the missile will still hit you because it kind of predicts where you are going. And I'll use this Picasso to show you exactly how that works. So we are locked up. We start pulling to the right. Now the missile of course sees this happening, and then we drop the flare. Now the flare is going to make sure that the Seekerhead actually turns off, but the missile knows where you are heading, and it's simply going to point the Seeker at where you would be if you had continued pulling into that direction. So it's important that you don't do that. And of Picassos, let's take a look at an actual example of how these missiles work, just to help you out a little bit. You can tell that I am locking him up and I have a circle around the plane. That is the FOV of the Seeker, that's 3.5 degrees. After I launch it, what does the missile do? It clamps down. It now has 0.75 degrees of FOV. And as you can see, that is essentially nothing. And because of the rise time of the flare, as well as the fact that they pop to the sides, the Seekerhead essentially never saw anything that was hot enough to actually fool it to fly away from the plane. And it's the same thing right here. We lock up the F-15, his dispensers are pointed away from us, he is pulling in, and this way the flares don't really stay in the FOV for the flares to heat up enough for the Seekerhead to actually care about the heat signature. It therefore just ignores it and flies directly into his tailpipe. Now we are going to reverse the F-16 and actually flare his AIM-9Ls, and this is a lot easier because the FOV is actually quite a bit bigger, and this makes it a lot easier for flares to stay in the FOV and actually heat up enough. Now make sure to actually drop your afterburner, because otherwise it will just basically fly through the flares and ignore them altogether. Now after we reverse him, we're gonna do the same thing again as we did to the F-15 and the J-8. We lock him up and he does the same thing. He pulls into us, he drops the flares downwards, and he doesn't give the flares any opportunity to actually distract the missile, and therefore he copes and dies. The AIM-9M works quite a bit differently. The AIM-9M turns off the Seekerhead and kind of freezes in place and tries to reacquire you with a slightly wider FOV. The wider FOV makes it so that flares do appear in the Seekerhead a little bit easier, but there's a little bit of nuance to it, because it does require some mechanics other than simply just lining up the flares. You have to know how these things work, and the best way to show you this is by simply going into the sensor view. I'm gonna be absolutely rippling these missiles off, so just try to keep up with me for a sec. So we are gonna launch one. We shoot the missile. The missile is tracking quite well. He drops flares. The flares are not properly in the FOV because it's coming from the side now, so this will keep tracking. Nuka notices this and he repositions himself to get the flares right in the FOV of all the 3 missiles at the same time. He drops a little bit of a curtain. More of that later. He rolls out of the way, and once the Seekers reacquire lock, or they start being turned on again, they simply fly straight because there is no plane in their FOV. Now the issue here comes with if you don't change direction. Nuka is now going to start flaring yet again. Take a look at this. He is going next-G, he is flaring, but the missile just kind of keeps flying straight at him because he never changed direction. Then the missile reacquires because Nuka is flying directly in front of the missile, and by the time he flares last second, it is too late and the missile will simply fly straight, and even though the Seekerhead might be turned off, it is still close enough to proximity fuse with its warhead. Good night, Nuka. So, this all looks absolutely positively terrible. How do we go around actually beating these things? But what if the missiles are being shot at you? With the IRCCM that clamps down like the R73 and the Magic 2, it's actually pretty simple. All you really do is point your dispensers at the enemy plane. Make sure you're offset a little bit so he's not directly behind you, otherwise you're eating shit. And you just kind of pull into it. Now with the F-16, this means you have to neg-G. With planes that have the dispensers on the top of the plane, you actually have to pull into the missile. Now be careful that you don't pull too much, because then you just kind of lead the missile out of the flares again. But as you can see, I'm simply lining it up. I drop the flares, and you don't really need that many if you aim it properly. Now it does take a little bit of getting used to, because if you miss it by like 5 to 10 degrees, you might just shoot the flares around the enemy missile and it will track you regardless. Now with the R73, it is important to keep your afterburner down. That makes your heat a little bit lower and it makes it a little bit more consistent. But again, all you just really are doing is put the flares in the Seekerhead. And the second the missile sees these flares, it's probably going to be fooled. And if you don't pull back into the Seekerhead, you're probably going to be completely fine. Now be careful that you don't get these missiles too close to you, because once they are close enough, the flares don't have enough rise time to actually fool the missiles. It's the same thing with the Magic 2, but they are a lot quicker and they close the gap a lot quicker because of that. So be careful that you don't wait too long. It's the same thing, you just have less of a reaction time. Now I keep my afterburner off, I aim the flares, drop one pop, and it's defeated. It's really that simple. Side aspect, it's really not that difficult either here. Just make sure the flares are in the Seekerhead. You can just kind of pull in. If you drop the flares, the missile is going to see the flares. It's going to lose your plane and you're completely okay. Side aspect with these things from medium range is really not that much of a trouble. Just kind of pull in, drop the flares, and the flares are going to be behind your vehicle. And if they drop upwards, they're going to be in between your missile and the vehicle as well. Side aspect, really not that much of a trouble. Head-ons, pretty easy to flare unless they do this. If you try to full commit head-on them, it will probably go through the flares if you don't pre-flare it. Now you can react flare it on the exact frame where they shoot a missile. If they have you radar locked, I recommend to just kind of go on an off angle like I am right here. And then you can just kind of pull in and you should be completely fine. And then we have the AIM-9M and the AAM-3. They both work the same way. AAM-3 is slightly more maneuverable, but most of these are simply by flaring it properly. There's two ways from behind. First one is directly pure 6. You just line up your plane with the missile, you spin in place, and most of the time the missile will simply miss. You don't need more than 4 pops at a time. As you can see right here, missile is just distracted and it flies off to Narnia. Now be careful that you line it up properly, because if you don't, as you can see right here, it reacquired us and that would have slammed me if I had just stayed put. The thing is, in the early stages, you do actually want to stay put, because if you line it up properly and you start doing the flower, guess what happens? The missile will still see you. Here I kind of just flail around, do the pattern, it doesn't matter, you get hit. Make sure to keep flying straight if it's lined up properly. And then we have the more reliable technique that works from multiple angles, but it does require a little bit of setting up. The first one is putting it in the correct quadrant of your screen. We have our flares coming up from the top, so we want to make sure that's either in the top left or the top right quadrant of our screen. Then you want to make sure you line up the missile with your plane, which we have done right here. And now the real magic starts happening. We are going to start pulling while rolling into the missile, and as the dispensers are pointed at the AIM-9M, we drop a little bit of a curtain, the missile gets defeated, and because we are pointed in another direction as the missile turned the seeker back on, it never picks us back up and we survive. Here it is in real time. We line it up, we make sure that we fly into the same direction, and we just kind of pull into it and we flare it. It's really that simple. Now it's on the left side of our screen, so we are going to roll to the left, we pull, we drop some flares at the missile, and the missile is defeated. And you can do this all day long. Now be careful that they don't creep up directly behind you and gun you down, because don't forget, they still have a lot of 20mm as well, these pesky ass AIM-9M havers. Or the 27, but if a gripping on your 6 starts catching you, you're probably dead regardless. Here's the last one, just for good measure. We roll in, we drop 2 flares this time around, missile defeated. Roll in, drop 2 flares, missile is gone. Make sure to not pull back into the Seekerhead. And not having your afterburner on does make the signature a little bit smaller, making it harder for the missile to reacquire you. But for the most part, you don't need to turn your afterburner off, because this missile does not care about the heat of your flare or the heat of your afterburner. But really, it is quite simple. Now this is of course in the perfect scenario where you know where the guy is, you have a good distance, and you make sure that you don't die. If they get really close to your 6, it of course becomes a lot harder, because your reaction time is going to diminish greatly. But this just comes down to practice, and that is something you have to do. Knowing how to do it is not gonna make you survive every scenario. I recommend you to practice this with a buddy in a custom battle, just so you can like tank 20 missiles without paying a lot of repair costs. And head-on is same thing as R73, same thing as direct rear. Just roll into it, drop flares while the launchers are pointed at the missile, and you're good. It's really that simple. At low speed this is a little bit more sketchy. You don't want to go 500 in front of an AIM-9M, but that's like stalling in someone's guns. You try to avoid that altogether. Some angles are simply not defeatable, but that's mostly an issue of setting up improperly. And then we have this side aspect. Now overall you want to just kind of avoid this, and this is not a realistic angle, but I want to show you anyway. If they come from like a 90-degree angle because you saw them a bit too late, you can simply pull in, and most of the time you don't even need flares. You can drop them for a little bit of safety, but most of the time the missile will simply not be able to pull in because it's simply leading too much. So keep it on your wing, pull in at like 2 kilometers, and the missile most of the time just doesn't have the ability to pull in. It is very sketch, and on maps like Afghanistan, where the air thickness is a little bit lower, the margins narrow even more. This becomes a pretty difficult dodge, but having a side aspect and simply pulling up or pulling down has basically nothing to do with flares, And if you try this at high altitude, you are 100% dead because you're not actually flaring the missile. As you can see on the screen, I'm simply dodging it without using any at all. My most reliable way is simply trying to pull into the head-on, if you are able to. As you can see, he comes from the side aspect and we just kind of pull in, we turn it into a head-on. We drop 50 million flares because we don't know what we're talking about, but of course it ends up working. You can just pull in, make it a bit of a side aspect head-on, drop a few flares and you are completely fine. Now you can also just do another thing, where if you see that someone shoots a missile at you and it's just completely out of range, when they shoot it from like 3 kilometers, you can just turn out and you're good. If for whatever reason you cannot fly towards him or you just want to reverse him because you're flying something like a Gripen, you can also just turn out and the missile will never reach you because it's simply not going fast enough. And sometimes you're not able to get anything but a direct side aspect launch. Now this is super sketch, it's quite hard to do and this takes quite a bit of practice. You roll in, you drop flares, while you're rolling in you roll on over while dropping more flares, and can see that the Seeker just goes for the flares and you are out of harm's way. Now this is fantastic, but I advise you to not get into this situation altogether. It is quite hard to replicate, and even this maneuver, you don't need that many flares. Maybe 5 to 10 pops at the most. You can probably get it down a little bit if you start getting better, but you don't need that many flares in almost any angle. There you go, that's 2 dodges in a row. Now let's take a look at actual gameplay that I just got, and we're gonna actually go as slow as possible just to make sure that we don't outpull it, because some people that make a video in a single day without any extra research don't seem to know the difference. So we start pulling in. First time here we're gonna go super fast. We are on Afghanistan. We pull up and over and you see the missile just goes down and flies straight. Absolutely fantastic. Let's take a look at another one. This time we're gonna go a little bit slower, under Mach 1, just at Mach 1, and we're gonna start pulling in. Again, this is Afghanistan. We pull in, we pull on over, missile gets very close. That wasn't a flare. We did kind of fool it for a second and that's why it didn't pull in. But if you aren't convinced just yet, we're gonna go 900, maybe 1000. We start pulling in, we drop a lot of speed, and there you go, the missile doesn't track. And if you are still not convinced, let's make it even slower. Now of course, these scenarios are pretty shitty and you try to avoid these at all costs, because you see that once I come out of this engagement, I'm going like 700 and I'm completely dead in the water. But you can flare them, it's just most of the time a bit of a skill issue. There are some angles that just kind of grief you, but you know, that is War Thunder, what can you do about it? Thank you all for watching, I hope it was helpful. Don't forget to click all the buttons down below and you will see me in the next one.